Now, after we are familiar with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution architecture, let's explore how and why you first need to identify your organization architecture and based on that, select appropriate deployment tools and methods to start with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint deployment in your organization. In previous section, we mentioned types of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint architectures. These are Cloud-native architecture, CO management architecture, on-premises architecture, and script and evaluation architecture. So to not get confused, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution is cloud solution, but these architecture types refer to onboarding devices to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and deploying agents to devices if needed. And that is something you can't do with Defender for Endpoint, obviously, because at that moment, endpoint devices are not yet connected to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution. And as there are more solutions to onboard devices to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, some of that solutions are not cloud-based. For example, Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager is on-premise tool. That is why besides cloud architecture, we can also have on-premise or CO management architectures, because endpoint onboarding and deployment must also be included in consideration. And for that part, on-premise solutions could be involved, even though Microsoft Defender for Endpoint by itself is cloud solution. Basically, when we say that you first need to identify your organization architecture, we mean that you need to choose which of these previously mentioned Microsoft Defender for Endpoint architectures would be best suitable for your organization. Obviously, each and every large enterprise organization and small ones as well are unique and have specific combinations of various systems and tools. But in general, we can divide all of them in cloud organizations, on-premise organizations, and hybrid organizations, which combine cloud and on-premise tools and workloads. These days, most large organizations are hybrid organizations, as we all tend to go to the cloud, but still can't leave certain on-premise workloads for various reasons. And for needs of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, what counts most is which kind of endpoint devices you wish to onboard to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And what are endpoint device management solutions you use for managing these devices. These are most important things you need to consider because not all endpoint device management solutions are suitable for all devices. Now, since one of the first steps in deploying Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution to your organization is actually verifying and if needed installing Defender agents on endpoint machines and afterwards onboarding endpoint machines to Defender for Endpoint Cloud, most important thing to consider and thing coming on top of cloud versus on-premise versus hybrid environment is what are endpoint device management solutions we will use for that. We need to use suitable endpoint device management solutions for various different operating systems. Because to deploy agent and to onboard the device cannot be done through Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Instead, it needs to be done using some endpoint management solution. Another reason why endpoint device management solution is needed besides device deployment and onboarding is because later you will also need to do some configurations, like applying attack surface reduction rules on endpoint machines, something that can't be done with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution. But instead, you will need to use, for example, Intune or local group policy, depending on which endpoint device management solution you use. If your environment, for example, has Linux servers, you will use Ansible management system to deploy agents to Linux machines using Ansible playbooks. For Windows client machines, you can use group policy or Intune. For Windows servers, you can use group policy or Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager, and so on. For complete and updated list of onboarding and configuration tool options for different operating systems, it is best that you look for Microsoft official documentation. But most important to note is that for agent deployment, onboarding and specific configuration management required in the scope of Defender for Endpoint solution, you also need to have endpoint management solutions for these endpoint machines. And that management solutions can be cloud or on-premise based, and not all are reliable for all types of endpoint devices. For example, let's say you operate a large organization and you already use a local group policy to manage endpoint devices. And now you are in a phase where you will onboard Windows client machines to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint solution. Now you can see that both Intune and group policy methods are appropriate ways to onboard your client machines to Defender for Endpoint, which means you can choose between these two deployment methods. If you wish to reduce on-premises traces in your company, you can choose Intune, and that decision will define your organization's Microsoft Defender for Endpoint architecture as cloud native, since Intune is cloud-based. And if you, on the opposite side, are still sticking with on-premise ways, you can use group policy, which will define your organization's Microsoft Defender for Endpoint architecture as on-premises. And that is how you identify your organization's architecture, and based on that, select appropriate deployment solutions. In next lesson, we will talk about how to prepare your organization for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint by identifying some key considerations.